5 minutes ago, phones started buzzing across Britain and beyond with the same explosive alert. Palace psychologist reveals details of Prince Louis' heartbreaking diagnosis. The headline flashed in red banners, notifications popped up on royal watcher accounts, and within moments the words heartbreaking and Prince Louis were trending side by side. For a child who has never given an interview, who has only ever appeared in short, carefully curated glimpses, waving from balconies, pulling faces at flypasts, clinging to his mother's hand on a windy church path, the idea that someone from inside the palace had suddenly stepped forward to announce a diagnosis felt like a rupture in the royal force field itself. Was this the moment the monarchy finally admitted that behind the polished images, one of its youngest members was struggling? Or was it something else entirely? A story about how far the media, the institution, and so-called experts are willing to go in order to control the narrative around a little boy who never asked to be famous. To understand why a single push notification could send such a shockwave, you have to go back to the version of Louis the world thinks it knows. For years, the public has seen a curated collage. The cheeky youngest child on the Buckingham Palace balcony clapping his hands over his ears while jets roar overhead. The little boy at a jubilee waving his arms, pulling faces, making his mother laugh and the internet melt. He is the mischievous one, the meme, the light relief in a family that so often looks tense and choreographed. Those brief, viral moments have been replayed millions of times, turned into GIFs, turned into headlines. But no one outside the palace walls truly knows him. They know fragments, seconds of footage, frozen images, one or two anecdotes shared in carefully managed interviews. That vacuum, the space between what's shown and what's hidden, is exactly where speculation festers. In recent years, royal commentators and body language experts have slowed down every frame, analyzed every twitch, every yawn, every time Louis turned away from the cameras or buried his face in Catherine's shoulder. Most viewers saw a tired child. Some online voices claimed to see something else and began attaching labels they had no right to use. The palace, for its part, stuck to the old formula: show a little, explain nothing, and hope the noise dies down. That strategy might have worked in the 1980s, when a handful of newspapers and networks controlled the story. It does not work in an age where every clip spawns 100 commentaries and every rumor finds a permanent home. Which is why what happened tonight felt so combustible. At the center of the storm is a woman most people had never heard of until this evening. A softly spoken child psychologist with decades of experience working around high-profile families and institutions. For years, she has been on the fringes of the royal world, not as a tabloid pundit, but as a discreet consultant called in to advise on things like school transitions, media pressure, and how to shield children from the worst of public life. Officially, she was always just an educational advisor, a title vague enough to satisfy curiosity without inviting questions. Unofficially, people inside the system called her something closer to what she really was, the person you brought in when the adults had run out of ideas. When word leaked that she would be giving a rare public lecture under the banner of a major London child development charity, most expected a gentle, general talk about screens, stress, and modern childhood. The palace had quietly signed off on her appearance. There would be no mention of specific children. They were assured, certainly no royal names. It would be abstract, academic, safe. And for the first 40 minutes, that's exactly what it was. She spoke calmly about the pressures of growing up in a performative culture, where children learn early that being watched is normal, and being watched while smiling is rewarded. She talked about families who turn birthdays into content and schools that send parents real-time photos of every classroom activity. She used phrases like hypervisibility and identity fragmentation, the kind of terms that usually stay buried in journals. Then, during the Q&A, someone asked the question that would detonate into tonight's headline. A journalist, attending under the guise of interested parent, stood up and said, "You've worked with children under intense public scrutiny. Without naming anyone, can you talk about what that does to a very young child who can't opt out of being photographed, who is expected to wave and smile on cue?" The room went very, very quiet. Everyone knew who he was really talking about. They were thinking of the little boy on the balcony, the one whose every grimace becomes a meme within minutes. For a long second, the psychologist, let's call her Dr. A, just looked at the floor. Then she did something the palace communications team would later describe as deeply unhelpful. She answered honestly. She didn't say Prince Louis. She never uttered a name. But she did talk in more detail than she ever had in public about a hypothetical child born into an institution where appearances matter more than comfort, where adults decide when you are seen and how, where your job at 5 years old is to be adorable, no matter how loud the flypast or how bright the cameras. She spoke about kids who become so used to performing that they forget what their own unobserved feelings look like. She spoke about little hands that shake before balcony appearances, about children who have learned that their genuine fear or boredom upsets the adults, so they replace it with a mask. And then she used a word that the tabloids would seize, twist, and inflate into something it was never meant to be. She called it a heartbreaking pattern, not a diagnosis. Not a label in a medical manual. A pattern, a way of living that chips away at a child's sense of self. She said that if adults around that kind of child weren't careful, the child could grow up believing they were only lovable when they were smiling for strangers. In the audience, several parents shifted uncomfortably, recognizing smaller versions of the same pattern in their own Instagram-documented homes. One reporter, however, heard only opportunity. Within minutes of the talk ending, phones were out, quotes half-remembered, notes rearranged. By the time the first article hit a news site, the nuanced, careful description of an unhealthy dynamic had become something far more clickable. Palace psychologist reveals heartbreaking diagnosis of royal child. The child didn't need to be named. The internet supplied the name for them. By the time the first TV panel fired up its opening graphic, red sirens, bold fonts, dramatic music, the original sentence from Dr. A's talk had already been chewed, half digested, and spat out as a brand new fact. A scrolling ticker on one channel screamed, "Heartbreaking diagnosis for Prince Louis?" While the host, brows knitted in performative concern, asked a studio psychiatrist who had never met a royal, "What does this say about the future of the monarchy?" The psychiatrist, careful with her words but undoubtedly aware of the cameras, tried to push back. "We don't know that this is about any specific child," she began. "We're talking about a dynamic that can affect many kids in the public eye." But nuance dies quickly in a ratings war. Within the same segment, archived clips of Louis at past events were already rolling in slow motion. The balcony, the jubilee, the way he pressed his hands over his ears during the flypast, the moment he buried his face into Catherine's shoulder at a loud event. Each clip was framed as evidence of an inner storm. On social media, the transformation was even faster and far less forgiving. A screenshot of Dr. A at the lectern mid-sentence was paired with a picture of Louis making a face at a parade. Captions read, "We knew something was off, and this explains everything." Threads popped up dissecting his behavior with an authority people hadn't earned and empathy they sometimes only performed. Amid the noise, one fact was notably absent. At no point had Dr. A said that Louis, or any royal child, had a specific diagnosable condition. She hadn't used clinical labels. She hadn't broken her duty of confidentiality. What she had done was shine a light on the emotional cost of treating children's lives as extensions of an institution's image. In the twisting, compressing mechanism of headlines and hashtags, that distinction vanished. Inside Kensington Palace, the mood shifted from routine evening to controlled crisis in minutes. Communications staff who had gone home were summoned back or patched into emergency calls. One aide, scrolling through early headlines, felt a chill at the way the story was being framed. As if a palace employee had confirmed every rumor, every speculative armchair diagnosis ever pinned on a 6-year-old. That was not what had happened. But in the court of public opinion, perception outruns correction. The first instinct, predictable, almost muscle memory, was to clamp down. Draft statements stressed that no official diagnosis of any royal child had been released, that the speaker had been referring to general patterns seen in public-facing families. Lawyers reviewed footage of the talk, checking for breaches of contract or confidentiality that might justify a legal shot across the bows. Some voices around the table urged an aggressive response, something that would warn anyone in royal orbit that this kind of candor would not be tolerated. But there was another current in the room, quieter but persistent. A younger advisor, more attuned to how quickly outrage can boomerang, asked, "If we go hard against her, what exactly are we saying? That she's wrong about the pressures, or that she shouldn't have said it out loud?" It was not a question with an easy answer, because buried beneath the panic and indignation was an uncomfortable truth. The patterns Dr. A had described did exist. Not just in palaces, but in influencer households and celebrity mansions and ordinary homes where kids learned to pose before they could read. The monarchy hadn't invented performative childhood, but it had industrialized it long before smartphones made it mainstream. For generations, royal children had waved from balconies, walked into churches on camera, stood in lines while strangers shouted their names. The difference now was that the entire world could replay, reframe, and reinterpret every second endlessly. At some point, The line between tradition and exposure had blurred, and nobody could quite say when. While officials argued over adjectives, Dr. A sat alone in a quiet flat across the city, watching her words spin away from her. She hadn't gone home unaware. During the last questions of the lecture, she could feel the tone in the room change, the phones coming out, the scribbling turning more frantic. She knew the risk the moment she chose to answer the journalist honestly. Still, seeing the phrase, heartbreaking diagnosis, slapped over her face felt like a betrayal of the children she had spent decades trying to protect. She hadn't given anyone a file. She hadn't whispered a child's name into a microphone. She described a wound she'd seen again and again, young people learning that their feelings were less important than the family brand. That night, instead of calling a lawyer, she wrote. By dawn, an open letter appeared on the website of the child development charity that had hosted her talk. It was not a retraction. It was a clarification, the kind that rarely gets as many clicks as the initial explosion but sometimes manages to steady the blast. She reiterated that she would never discuss an individual child's medical or psychological history in public. She explained that when she spoke of a heartbreaking pattern, she meant exactly that. A pattern of adults, systems, and audiences asking children to perform emotional states on cue, happiness, gratitude, resilience, at the expense of their actual, unedited experience. She acknowledged that yes, the royal context had informed her understanding, but no, the problem was not confined to palaces. If you see a child on a balcony in a vlog or in an advert, she wrote, and your first instinct is to diagnose them instead of asking what the adults around them are asking them to carry, then you are looking in the wrong direction. The letter raced more quietly than the first wave of outrage, but it found its way to some crucial places. Pediatricians shared it. Teachers shared it. So did parents who recognized themselves a little too clearly in its examples, not as villains, but as people who had, at times, put their need for a perfect picture above their child's need to simply be. In one corner of the internet, the reaction shifted. Threads appeared under a different hashtag, Leave Louis Alone. Nurses and therapists began chiming in with reminders that speculation about any child's mental health from afar is not just unkind, it can be dangerous. You are not seeing a diagnosis, one child psychiatrist posted under a grainy balcony clip. You're seeing a moment stripped of context, replayed for entertainment. Real assessment takes time, privacy, and consent, none of which you have. For perhaps the first time since the story broke, some of the most viral comments weren't the ones guessing at acronyms, but the ones asking, why are we so comfortable dissecting a child we don't know? Inside the palace, the mood evolved from pure defense to something more complicated. William and Catherine were not in the communications war room drafting phrases, but they were briefed on the outlines. As parents, the idea that strangers were diagnosing their son from sofa seats stung at a level that had nothing to do with constitutional duty. They were said to be torn between fury at a world that thinks a 6-year-old's every grimace is public property, and guilt that they had allowed more of him to be seen than was wise simply by following the template they inherited. They hadn't invented the balcony. They had inherited it, but they had also, perhaps unconsciously, leaned into the narrative of Louis as comic relief because it made the internet like him, and by extension like them. Now they were watching that same narrative morph into something they couldn't control. In the days that followed, a strange duality emerged. On the one hand, the palace continued to offer small, carefully timed glimpses of Louis walking to school, baking with his siblings, holding his mother's hand on a casual countryside outing. The photographs were softer, less performative, more back of the head than front page grin. On the other hand, there was a noticeable tightening of the frame. No more long lens shots of him fidgeting through formal ceremonies. No more extended balcony footage cut into reaction compilations. When he did appear, the moments were shorter, more contained, like someone had finally realized that the simplest way to protect a child from overanalysis is to give the world less to dissect. But the genie was already halfway out of the bottle. The question had been asked. How much of a child's inner life should be fodder for public discussion simply because of their last name? That question didn't just belong to the monarchy anymore. It belonged to every viewer who had ever chuckled at a clip, shared a meme, or read an article diagnosing a stranger's son from a 20-second video. If there was any comfort to be found in the chaos, it lay in the fact that the palace, the press, and the public were all, in their own ways, being forced to look at the same uncomfortable mirror. For decades, the monarchy had existed inside a carefully controlled bubble of never complain, never explain, a mantra that worked when information moved slowly, and most people only saw the royals a few times a year in grainy photographs or 15-second news clips. But now that same family lived in a world where a 5-year-old split-second grimace could be zoomed in, GIF-ed, captioned, and broadcast to millions within hours. The old rules, say nothing, show only what you choose, collided violently with a culture that demands constant access and instant answers. Some of the older courtiers wanted to cling tighter than ever to those old rules. They argued that acknowledging the conversation around Louis, even to shut it down, would legitimize it. "If we address it, we make it real," one insisted in a late-night meeting, jabbing a finger at a stack of tabloid front pages. "He's a child. Our job is to rise above this." Others, especially those who had come of age in the social media spin cycle, knew that silence doesn't always read as dignity anymore. It can look like indifference, or worse, confirmation. One young staffer, exhausted and blunt, finally said what no one wanted to say out loud. "If strangers are more protective of him online than we appear to be, we have a problem." In the background of these arguments, the media machine kept churning. Some outlets doubled down, commissioning think pieces about the burden on the spare's spare, and resurrecting dusty quotes from historians about royal children raised as symbols rather than sons and daughters. Others, wary of being seen as bullies, pivoted to broader stories about children in the spotlight, quietly keeping the SEO hook of Louis's name in the subhead while claiming to discuss the issue in general terms. It was a familiar trick. Talk about one child, pretend you're talking about all of them. Yet amid the cynicism, there were genuine shifts too. A major breakfast show scrapped a pre-planned segment that would have shown adorable outtakes of royal kids and influencers, toddlers side by side. Instead, a producer suggested a panel on consent and childhood privacy, featuring not gossip columnists but a teacher, a pediatrician, and a young activist who had grown up in a vlogging family and now campaigned for children's digital rights. For once, a royal story had pushed the conversation somewhere more useful than cute or cringe. Quietly away from cameras, the palace reached out to Dr. A not with a threat, not at first, but with an invitation cloaked in courtesy. Would she be willing to come in and clarify her comments, to ensure that misunderstandings did undermine the important work she does? She knew what that kind of language could mean. Clarify in these circles could be code for apologize, retract, or quietly agree never to speak like that again. Still, she accepted. Walking through side entrances and staff corridors, she felt the familiar weight of old walls and older expectations. This was not the first time she had sat opposite people whose entire lives were built on the idea that image is survival. But it was the first time the focus had been so squarely on a child who had become the internet's favorite wild card. The meeting room was smaller than the public might imagine, less like a throne chamber, and more like an old boardroom with too many portraits. Around the table sat a handful of senior aides, a legal advisor, and one woman from the younger generation of staff who introduced herself simply by first name. They began with controlled politeness. They praised her decades of work, emphasized that the family deeply valued expertise in child development, and acknowledged that her intentions were undoubtedly good. Then, like a tide rolling in, the real agenda emerged. Her words had been misinterpreted in highly damaging ways. They had caused distress. They had fueled speculation about a specific child. The implication was clear. She had lit the fuse, even if she hadn't directed the explosion. Dr. A listened, then did something these rooms were not accustomed to. She pushed gently back. She repeated calmly that she had never named any child, never shared confidential information, and never used diagnostic labels. What she had described, she reminded them, existed long before this particular 6-year-old was born. "If tonight's headlines had used a stock photo of a child actor instead of your prince," she said quietly, "the pattern would still be heartbreaking. The difference is that you have the power to change it here." The room fell very still. No one liked being told they had power not like that. Power is something royal houses prefer to describe as duty, service, responsibility, anything but the raw, undeniable ability to decide what a child will endure in the name of tradition. The younger staffer, the one who had introduced herself by first name only, finally spoke. "What does change it look like?" she asked. It was an opening nobody expected. Dr. A didn't hand them a magic formula. Instead, she offered principles. Reduce frequency of mandatory appearances. Stop turning every mildly funny clip into an official social media moment. Allow children to say no and mean it when they don't want to be on show. Stop rewarding only the charming moments and start quietly valuing the ordinary, unphotographed ones. And perhaps most radical of all, she suggested something that seemed, to some in the room, almost sacrilegious. "At some point," she said, "you may need to say publicly that he is a child first and a symbol second, and that you will protect his inner life even if it disappoints the audience." There it was, the crack in the wall, the suggestion that the monarchy owes a 6-year-old more than it owes the crowd. No one agreed in that moment. Too much tradition, too many fears, too many headlines waited on the other side of such a statement. But seeds, once dropped into the right soil, have a way of growing in unexpected corners. In the days that followed, while the tabloids moved on to fresher scandals and faster gossip, the palace's eventual response emerged, not as a dramatic press conference, but as a short, almost understated paragraph tucked into a broader update about royal engagements. It did not mention Dr. A, it did not mention diagnoses or conditions or even rumors. Instead, a spokesperson said simply that the Prince and Princess of Wales were grateful for the interest shown in their children, but wished to gently remind everyone that all children, regardless of who their parents are, deserve space to grow, learn, and make mistakes without their every expression being analyzed. It added, more pointedly than some expected, that speculation about any child's mental or emotional health from afar is neither helpful nor fair. Some commentators scoffed. They wanted names, explanations, and denials, not vague appeals to decency. Others, particularly parents and professionals, quietly applauded. It was the most direct the palace had ever been about setting a boundary around the younger generation. Whether they would honor that boundary in practice was another question entirely. Because statements are easy, habits are harder. The real test would not be the carefully vetted words issued on headed paper. It would be the next balcony, the next jubilee, the next Christmas walk to church. When the cameras lined up and the crowds roared and the world waited for the cheeky youngest prince to do something meme-worthy again, would the adults around him make a different choice? Months later, the test arrived in the form it always does for this family. Not as a crisis meeting or a leaked memo, but as a date circled quietly on the court circular. Trooping the color, the balcony, the flypast. For days beforehand, commentators asked the same question in slightly different ways. Would Prince Louis be there, front and center, ready to pull faces and clap his hands over his ears? Or would his parents, newly cautious, keep him further back or off the balcony altogether? Every option carried a story. If he appeared and acted as he always had, some would say the palace had learned nothing. If he stayed hidden, others would claim the rumors were true and the institution was panicking. Somewhere between spectacle and absence lay a narrower path, presence without performance. On the morning itself, the familiar choreography unfolded. Carriages through the mall, scarlet tunics, the thud of drums. In the last carriage, eagle-eyed viewers spotted a small figure between his siblings, dressed crisply but leaning more into his father's side than he once might have. When the family stepped onto the balcony, the cameras did what they always do. They zoomed. Social media accounts hit go live. For a heartbeat, there was a collective, unspoken holding of breath, as if millions of strangers were waiting not for the planes, but for a child's reaction to them. When the roar finally came, Louis flinched. Of course he did. They are loud, and he is young, but this time something else happened too. Catherine's hand, instead of nudging him forward to wave, simply found his and stayed there. She leaned down, said something only he could hear, and when he turned his face up to her, the cameras caught not a performative grin but an entirely ordinary expression. A little wary, a little excited, utterly human. Then, instead of lingering on him, the palace's official feed cut wide, showing the whole family, the crowd, the sky. For once, the youngest prince was not the focal point. He was just one child among many on a busy balcony. Some viewers grumbled online. They missed the content, the chaos, the easy memes. "He's so boring now," one comment read under a wide-angle shot. Others, perhaps remembering the frenzied speculation of months before, replied differently. "Good, let him be boring, he's 6. Many parents watching felt unexpectedly relieved by his calm presence there. It was not a fairy tale transformation. The monarchy did not suddenly become a model of transparent, trauma-informed parenting. There would still be future events, future missteps, future headlines written by people who confuse access with entitlement. But a small recalibration had taken place, one that began not with a diagnosis, but with a description of harm and the decision, however imperfectly executed, to try to reduce it. In the end, the most heartbreaking part of this saga was never a clinical label attached to a file. It was the realization of how quickly adults, palace officials, pundits, viewers were willing to project their own narratives onto a child whose inner life they could not possibly know. The so-called palace psychologist had not revealed Prince Louis's secrets. She had revealed ours, our appetite for drama, our hunger for labels, and our habit of confusing visibility with understanding. Whether the monarchy truly changes the way it treats its youngest members remains to be seen. Whether the media learns to draw a line around children who did not volunteer for the spotlight is another open question. But there is one decision that does not belong to the palace, the press, or any algorithm. It belongs to the person watching. The next time a clip of Louis, or any child in a famous family, slides into your feed with a sensational caption and 100 armchair diagnoses in the comments, you will have a choice. You can slow it down, zoom in, join the chorus that treats someone else's son as a puzzle to be solved. Or you can scroll past, remembering that behind every balcony, every camera, every carefully crafted image is a child who deserves room to grow without strangers assigning them a story. Perhaps in the end, that is the only breaking news that really matters.